You need to sit down for this one. I don't think anyone has put deeper and more profound questions to Jordan Peterson than this, and you're about to see many layers to Jordan's thought unravel in the process to reveal a vulnerable, hurting core, and I truly believe that it takes someone of moral grit to be able to admit it, especially around eternal truths like morality, vulnerability, and the necessity of gratitude. I want you to notice the visible emotional toll that it takes on Jordan Peterson throughout this conversation, because I need to tell you how, in fact, it's a reflection of all of us in modern society, so subscribe to the channel, take a look at this before we dive in.
How are you able to keep your ego in check with, what's happened over the past decade, just absolutely blowing up and becoming, famous, essentially, acquiring wealth?
I read a paper a long time ago called Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, which is written by Carl Jung, and it's a great paper, but no one can understand it unless they know what it's about. It's about that problem. So I talk about archetypal matters, right? And that has produced a focus of attention on my work. Well, that's not me. You have to make sure that you don't confuse yourself with the truth, let's say, like in a personal manner. So the fact that I can explain, let's say, the Enuma Elish, which is a Mesopotamian creation myth, doesn't mean that I figured it out. I didn't create the story. So you have to distinguish yourself from the effect that the ideas have. You don't want to take credit for that. Partly because it's extreme. First of all, it won't work. You will definitely crash and burn if you do that. 100%. That's the story of Icarus. You don't want to do that. You don't want to fly too close to the sun and have the heat melt all the wax in your wings.
I think Jordan Peterson understands one thing very intimately in life, which is that pride comes before the fall. But there's no doubting the fact that in nearly a decade that Jordan Peterson has become a global phenomenon, there have been plenty of incidents that could instead be used to inflate his ego and pride. How long can you have thousands of people attending your lectures, telling you how you've helped them in their life, and even at times coming and crying at your feet to ask for solutions before it goes to your head and you start seeing yourself as some sort of messiah? Well, the truth is that's what has happened to a lot of people in history, while the primary reason for their appeal became corrupted with ego until ego alone is what drove them. One of my favorite quotes from Jordan Peterson is when he said the most valuable currency in the world is trust. The whole reason that someone like Jordan Peterson would even get to the point of such public notoriety and respect is because the people he speaks to trust that he's one of them and he can relate to their troubled lives. He doesn't sit elevated, detached from the people while lecturing them in a sort of finger-wagging way from high above, and that's what keeps his ego in check, because Jordan Peterson understands above all else how quickly he can lose all that respect and adoration he's built the moment he starts to view it as a consequence of anything other than the trust that he's built with people.
And then I have people around me, I have good counselors. My wife, very level-headed. My son and my daughter are awake and they keep an eye on things. And I have friends too that play the same role. So we're evaluating and watching all the time, trying to be careful. And I try to be careful. And remember too, to be grateful for all the opportunities that I have and for the fact that people aren't throwing stones at me, which they easily could be.
I think gratitude is definitely a formidable opponent for an ego.
Definitely.
Yeah. And then obviously also having some people to keep you grounded, some people that you trust.
Yeah, right. Well, that's part of that distribution of sanity. It's like if you have a complex situation, you're going to need a number of people around you to evaluate and investigate and make the way forward. And so, I'm fortunate too that I worked with my wife and we figured out how to work very closely together. And she has a cardinal role to play, and I work with my kids, and that works out very well. And so we're constantly communicating about how to negotiate what's in front of us.
What would you say is your biggest insecurity?
My biggest insecurity. Well, it's probably related to the question that you asked. It's like, how do you keep your feet on the ground? And I'm constantly reminding myself how fortunate I am. My wife almost died that was quite the catastrophe. I was extremely ill for 3 years in an unbelievable amount of pain. That's gone. People, I'm traveling all around the world and people are pleased to see me. I don't take that for granted. I'm very careful with people. I don't presume that that's normal or ordinary ever, because it's not. I remind myself before I go on stage that I'm lucky to be there, lucky to be alive, lucky that it's not a mad mob, because it easily could be. So gratitude is an antidote to resentment and arrogance.
Isn't that an interesting window into how fate and the uncertainty of life itself can paradoxically keep you from flying off the handle? It's hard to find a silver lining when you've had such a brush with your own demise as Jordan did, but if it helps instill the sense in you that you're just as mortal and vulnerable as everyone else, perhaps that can shine through in your speech like a light. When things are going too well, it's easy to think you're invincible, and that's what breeds a seed of arrogance, and it's hard to even blame people for that because perhaps it's just human nature. But when you think about it, it's impossible to sit on a moral and intellectual high horse to talk down to people while also having their respect and reverence for long. At some point, people see through that act, which is why there are very few people that can replicate that kind of success that Jordan Peterson has seen. People can relate to him because he's just as broken and flawed as them, and he can relate to the people because he's consistently reminded that he's just as vulnerable and mortal as anyone else. That's also where Jordan's conception of morality struck me as particularly interesting as a puzzle piece that completes his worldview. Take a look at this.
In the podcasts, I still probably don't have my podcasts optimized. I still talk probably more than I should in my podcasts, but I've always talked more than I should ever since I was like 2. So and there's obviously advantages in it because I'm very verbally fluent, and that fact has enabled what I've done. And so, everything can be carried to excess. I'm good at listening when I remember to listen. And I like to listen. I'm very interested in people. And so, that makes it easy for the podcasts.
But it's more of a conscious effort. Because I feel like I've observed a couple times in this podcast where you've noticed your string of conversation and then you kind of think about it for a second. And then you're like, okay, I should come to a resolve or something. Or would you say that isn't what happened?
Well, when I'm speaking, I'm paying attention to how the words are landing.
Yeah.
Which is something that people can learn to do. It's a very useful thing to learn to do. You can watch and you can see if what you're saying makes you stronger or weaker. And you can more or less feel that with every word. And you can learn to put your foot down where the ground is solid. And that's unbelievably useful. That's what I'm doing all the time that I'm speaking. It's like, where's the next bit of solid ground? Now, I can get carried away with enthusiasm, and then I remind myself to look more.
Are you afraid of death?
I'm afraid of other things more.
Why? Because death to me just seems like there's nothing that we can confirm in terms of an afterlife. So to me, that seems terrifying. I would be more worried about that than other things.
I don't think about that ever really because it's beyond my capacity of comprehension. So I just leave that lie fundamentally. But if death is the thing you're most afraid of, you're very fortunate. So there are things that are far worse than death, like far worse. So I would say I've experienced a fair number of those. So
what would you say is worse?
Unbearable pain that doesn't go away.
Yeah.
Moral culpability. How much do you want to be responsible for the suffering that your stupidity has engendered? So that's rough. So that's why there's conceptualizations of the soul, let's say, in classic religious writings. You strive to protect not your life, but your soul. And that's right. And it's hard for modern people to understand that because modern people think that there's no fear worse than the fear of death. But that's just because they lack imagination. So if you have enough imagination, this is why the terror management theorists, for example, are wrong. We construct our beliefs to protect us against death anxiety. It's like, if the thing you're most worried about is your own demise, then you you haven't delved very far down the rungs of Dante's Inferno, because there's things that are much worse than death. So that's why sometimes people regard death as a relief.
It's impossible not to be moved by something like this. Humans as a species have a bit of a curse in that regard. We're the only creatures capable of thinking abstract thoughts to such a degree, and that's why we can extrapolate all the way to thinking abstractly about our own demise. That terrifies us and makes us conjure up beliefs and reassurances as a defense against it. But for the most part, people have an instinct to create a legacy that they think they can leave behind, almost as a proxy for themselves after they pass. That's what Ernest Becker was talking about with his work in the 1970s. Perhaps that's what it is for Jordan Peterson as well, that desire to leave a mark and a legacy, and maybe that's not a bad goal after all, because it includes our ultimate demise as a factor in every decision we make in our lives. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are about this profound conversation, because it certainly takes a lot of introspection to be able to remove so many layers and think about this deep yet uncomfortable issue that a lot of people would rather just brush aside as long as they can.